Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday morning. Mr. Sabi.
Good morning, sir. Is anybody representing the People's Republic of China here? If not, Mr. Chairman, if, with your permission, we'll start with our first witness this morning, is Mr. Ethan Goodman.
Thank you. Mr. Goodman, thank you for coming to help the tribunal by giving evidence. And you understand, of course, that you must tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Goodman, if I may start asking regarding your statement, which is, by the way, at page 231 of the book in front of you.
I'm sorry, which page?
231, it's the start of it.
Okay. Okay, I got it. Good. Yeah.
Mr. Goodman, you seem to be extremely alarmed by the plight of Uyghurs and the suggestion that 15 million Uyghurs, every man, woman, child, is blood tested, DNA sampled. Can you explain to the tribunal why you're so worried about Uyghurs?
Well, Human Rights Watch was the one who the group that broke the news that there was DNA testing of the Uyghurs. That was backed up by RFA, Radio Free Asia. The significance was that they left something out. It wasn't just DNA testing, which could be explained as basically as a deterrent against terrorism, a way to track families so that entire families can be persecuted or at least held responsible for a terrorist act. That's the advantage of DNA. But they were actually doing blood testing as well. Now, this is something we saw about 3 or 4 years earlier with Falun Gong. Right around the time my book was coming out, for the first time, Falun Gong were being examined in their own homes, not in labor camps or any part of the Laogai system, black jails, detention centers, and so forth. The police were actually coming in and administering a DNA cheek swab and also a blood test. At the time, I thought, well, perhaps that's just a scare tactic because it was so obviously connected to organ harvesting. It was so clearly connected to the potential for tissue matching. But this was a repetition of that, except it was on a vast scale. And the 15 million is an estimate. We believe it's between 12 million to 17 million. That's my middle figure. We don't know how many Uyghurs are in Xinjiang. But I think that's the middle estimate. The problem with that is that we also have one other factor, which I didn't mention. As the temperature on this issue increased through the press, global press, and including the United Nations, which actually brought it up as an issue, the million Uyghurs in detention, or 500,000 to 1 million. The 300,000 of the Uyghurs it was early October, and 300,000 of these Uyghurs disappeared or were taken to other provinces. Now, there are a lot of ways to interpret that. Perhaps it was just an attempt because Google was picking up the construction of all these vast labor camps that were growing like cancers across the landscape of Xinjiang. But the fact is that it's also true that Xinjiang does not have a fantastic medical infrastructure, or at least a big enough infrastructure to handle these people. So it's very possible. We believe they went to Qinghai, which has a highly developed transplant infrastructure, or at least some 100,000 of them, maybe. We don't know. But all of these signs, if you put them all together, along with the building of crematorium, 50 security guards for a crematorium, which is unreasonable by any standards. These people are, the guards are being paid $1,200 US a month. This is an extremely high salary for that region. This is, if you put those facts together, that's extremely concerning.
And you refer to this as cold genocide? Can you explain that?
I said, what I was doing was quoting somebody else's work. Torsten Trey and David Matus put together a piece, I believe it's in the Journal of Genocide Studies or something. I'm not quite, can't remember it right now, called Cold Genocide, which was about the idea of a extended period of a genocide, a slow motion genocide is what I'd call it, not really a cold genocide. I don't like to use terms like genocide too often because I think they're distracting from the issue at hand, but then they have certain meaning in a legal context, which maybe is important. So I have really no comment on that. I'm not a legal expert.
Mr. Goodman, would you be able to provide the tribunal with an estimate or an idea of the size of organ transplantation in China? How many per year, if that is not too simplistic?
The simplistic part is trying to come up with an absolute number. I'm not even sure China has that number. You know, even the experts in China, even the people administering these programs may not have that number. So I want to go step back on that for a minute. I mean, one of the best witnesses in this area, outside a somewhat objective witness, is Dr. Ko Wen-je, the surgeon from National Taiwan University. He was involved with teaching ECMO in China, and he knows a lot of these surgeons. And I called him when we were still, our relationship was still very good, and I said, there's a rumor that there's some sort of vast database of Falun Gong practitioners that can be harvested. And I said, is that true? Is there such a database? And he said, no, it's done through an informal eBay system between the doctors. It's kind of a doctor net, all right? Now, that does not strike me as a system which is, well, it doesn't strike me as something like the Holocaust, where you had the Germans put together a firm plan and they actually had estimates of how many Jews were in each country, absolute estimates, down to the individual level. So we don't know, but we can use ranges, and that's what we tried to do in our 2016 report, which is the last time we tried to estimate the volume of transplants in China. And there we came up with 60,000 to 100,000 transplants per year. Now, you can take a middle figure from that. You can take a low figure from that. You can take a high. Actually, we came up with a higher estimate. I personally lowered that estimate because of my experience in China with the tendency to describe a fish that was this big as this big, right? I'm gesticulating with my hand to show a slightly bigger fish. That is, there's a tendency for also the hospitals in China, and there must be at least 5 hospitals which claim to do more liver transplants than anybody else. It's a bit like best curry in town. It's one of those things. Now, that does not mean those numbers are meaningless. There's a reason, and I'm sorry to give a long answer here, but I think this is an important element. You know, when we put out our 2016 update, our report, there were a lot of people involved, and there's some people even in this room who might remember this. Everybody wanted us to write a executive summary of the report. It's 700 pages. It's got 2,400 footnotes. And me and David Kilgore and David Matus said no, again and again and again. And actually somebody did come up with an executive summary and stuck it on there, but that's beside the point. We released it without any of that. And the reason we did that was because we wanted journalists, we wanted government staff members, congressional staff members, and people in the Foreign Office here to wade into those numbers a bit, to go into the report, because that's really where you start to get a feeling for a pattern here, the size of the thing. And so when this estimate of 60 to 100,000 has a basis of about 1 transplant per day, per every hospital which was authorized at that time to do transplants by the Ministry of Health. We think that's probably a very low estimate. Now, even then, you can go with the government figures now, because we're now in 2018, and I believe it was just 3 weeks ago, maybe it was 4 weeks ago, that Huang Jiefu, who is the master of ceremonies of these numbers for the West, has said that they are going to be doing 50,000 transplants by the year 2020. So he has embraced our number. Now, you know, he's embraced it for very different reasons, I believe. I believe I don't believe this is a real number, but for whatever reasons, he's now sort of said, yes, well, it's up in that level. And this was something they originally, of course, said this was a terrible, outrageous accusation. It's really only 10,000 to 13,000 a year.
Thank you. The panel, the tribunal has read your excellent work both in the update and slaughter. You do mention that slaughter have little to do with how of organ harvesting, but is about why. Have you found the answer then? Why?
Well, the answer, in my opinion, though again I leave it up to you, to anybody who reads the book, to come up with their own explanations. That's why I try very hard to give people the information to do that. I would argue that the reason changes quite dramatically over time. That initially the crackdown on Falun Gong is it's a very typical move by the Public Security Bureau of China. It's not unusual. Zhonggong was 30 million people. They were cracked down in a matter of 2 months. Their leader was killed or had a mysterious accident in a highway in Atlanta, near Atlanta. They were finished. The assumption was, and I know this from talking to the 610 officer, that they assumed it would take 3 months with Falun Gong. Over time, it changes quite significantly because Falun Gong puts up a strong fight. I don't mean a physical fight, really, exactly, but in the prisons, people refuse to recant. They refuse to write rejection letters. They refuse to rat on their friends and so forth. And this leads to a kind of resistance where even in prison, where nobody can really hear you scream, these things build. And over time, that leads to even more. Leads to also inspires the international world a bit, or at least Falun Gong practitioners in the international world, to build media, to build an infrastructure of resistance. That takes place. That turns the fight kind of global. Now, I'm putting it that way. There's another way of looking at it, which is to look down from the Chinese perspective. But even there, it becomes clear that at some point they're not really fighting about Falun Gong itself anymore. They're fighting about who is going to survive this. That it becomes seen as a real dagger aimed at the heart of the Chinese Communist Party. And then with the advent of organ harvesting, it becomes something new. It becomes a cover-up, a vast cover-up. And from the Marxist perspective, to simplify it greatly, the best way to cover something up is to simply eliminate everybody who was involved. Mostly victims, but you can see in the case of certainly Stalin's Kulak program in the Ukraine, you can see how that worked. You know, if I were a doctor, a surgeon in China who'd been directly involved in extractions, I wouldn't be sleeping well.
Mr. Goodman, would you be able to let the tribunal know that how many first-hand accounts have you heard directly from the witnesses, apart from the ones that you receive from other people's reports, but your own experience?
I interviewed about 150 people. I would say out of those, this is approximation, but about 100 of them I interviewed in depth. I had many years to do this. The ones I interviewed the closest are some of the ones I referred to in the statement I gave you. The 50 refugees from labor camp, that was the most, usually the longest and most intense interviews, because they had to unload a lot of baggage to sort of get to the real story. That's about the number, really. I would say that there's 50 to 75 people who were interviewed very closely and 75 fairly peripherally.
In your opinion, is this transplantation concentrated in any special area of China, or is it spread all over the country?
Well, it used to be concentrated in the military hospitals in the beginning. That's quite clear. And so much of that was in certainly Shenyang and Tianjin province in general, certainly Beijing, and to some extent Shanghai was a little bit of a latecomer, although there's one exception to that, which is near Guangdong. You have Sun Yat-sen University, which is very involved in organ harvesting right from the beginning, and one of the pioneers. So after that, it spreads throughout the entire country. And I think if you look at the 2006 report, Bloody Harvest, and compare it to what came out in the update, you can see that spread. It's quite dramatic. You can't really create a very good map of this anymore because it's nothing but you'd really have to have a large-scale map, which would then not turn into a sea of black dots. Every province is now claiming to do major transplantation. They're all competitive in this.
And do we know exactly when this transformation came about from being concentrated in one or two areas to spread all over, to be spread all over China?
I can say there are three factors that are topmost in my mind. I'm sure there are others, but the three factors are the rise of Falun Gong detention, which there's a clear tracking of the rise of this industry along with Falun Gong and detention. And the severity of the persecution, which increases over time, especially after around 2002. The rise of anti-rejection drugs, or at least better anti-rejection drugs, and Chinese manufacture, often counterfeit of anti-rejection drugs. And finally, there's one other aspect which I've been starting to look at now, which is the rise of ECMO, that is the oxygenation of the lungs and heart, which can be used in an off-label way, actually during live organ extraction, and also preserves the organs afterwards for about 8 hours extra, which really improves the chance of actually getting these organs to perhaps wealthy organ tourists, or maybe not so wealthy organ, just domestic Chinese, but wealthy organ tourists like Japanese, you're suddenly looking at huge prices for a potential human being properly, if the extractions are done in a proper way, you can get about 650,000 US on a theoretical basis for a single person with ECMO. Otherwise, it's logistically almost impossible to get that many people assembled within a live organ harvesting situation.
Finally, do you know that from the Chinese point of view, Chinese government point of view, or to be specific, 610 office, how do they consider Falun Gong practitioners? Do they consider them as a religion, just a practice, or a cult? How would they view Falun Gong practitioners?
I have a hard time answering that because of the propaganda on this is just propaganda. I spent a lot of time with a 610 officer. It's in my book. He dominates one of the chapters. I interviewed him 4 times. I went back to Australia 3 times to interview him. The last time I interviewed him was with a bottle of scotch. We talked very deeply. This was not an issue that came up very much. He was not terribly interested in that. This was a declared enemy of the state. He didn't really have strong views about it. He thought they were kind of nutty. Over time, he became very involved with one woman who was almost beaten to death, and he would go and visit her in the hospital. And originally, he found her tiresome. He told me this. He found her tiresome and annoying because she talked about Falun Gong all the time. Over time, he started to feel like the strange one, and then he eventually defected. Now, I don't think his case is, I think his case is unusual. I don't know what the views were, except that he thought that Falun Gong was just simply an enemy of the state. He believed when he looked at the pictures of all these wounded people and women whose faces had been charred by electric batons and so forth, that it was fakes. These were all clever fakes. And one of the reasons why he got so involved with this woman who'd been tortured very severely was that it was right in front of his eyes, and it wasn't a fake, and she was beaten to and she looked like his mother. So I don't believe that the opinions, I think the opinions about this thing are all over the map in China. That's always been my impression. It was my impression when the Falun Gong persecution began. Many Falun Gong were Communist Party members at that time. Some were in the Public Security Bureau of China. The China Central Television had its own practice session, as did, I believe, Xinhua News Agency as well.
Thank you. The tribunal will have some questions for you.
Mr. Goodman, your process of interview, you tell us, was intentionally slow, intentionally unfocused in the beginning, in order that those being interviewed would reveal everything of relevance, even if they didn't understand something was of relevance for you, correct?
That's correct.
Taking the time that you did, do you think it was even remotely possible that any person interviewed who had been medically examined would not have mentioned it in the slow unraveling of the story that you dealt with?
Oh, I know that happened. Yes, I'm certain that they didn't.
Sorry, you're certain that what?
I'm certain that what the scenario you just described is exactly happened, that they would not reveal it, or that they didn't even think to reveal it.
Well, to begin with, but in the slow process of your unraveling, can you be confident that it was bound to emerge?
No, because the trauma that people experienced in Laogai system was so severe that people would often forget about a pleasant day relatively pleasant day, where they were examined by a doctor and just had a few needles stuck in them.
Having concluded the interviews in the manner that you've described, there would have been nothing to stop you at the end saying, thank you, by the way, were you ever medically examined? Did you ask that question?
Sometimes I did. And what happened is they would say, I don't remember. So that happened occasionally. And I couldn't use that if they didn't remember. It was just...
Because in your statement and in your other materials at page 232, you speak of the 8 unambiguous cases who had been tested for potential harvesting, of a total number interviewed of 100...
No, 50.
Of 50. Was it 70, I thought?
No, I'm saying there were 70 very close interviews. The other 20 were doctors, former politicos, and so forth.
50, yeah. The other 42 from the 8, may we take it they said nothing about medical examination?
No, they often did describe a medical examination, but I had to kind of throw the case out because they were hunger striking at the time. And so that was approximately 10 cases of those. They were examined, but if you're hunger striking, it could be a benevolent act to give somebody an examination, make sure they're not going to die on your care, and so forth.
So you were applying your own judgment, which was very experienced, and identifying those whose account of medical examination was at least consistent with their having been medically examined for the purpose of organ harvesting. And it was only 8 of 50 who provided that evidence. Allowing for the fact that some may have, of the remaining 42, may have suffered amnesia, or may indeed have been disinclined to speak with this, there were probably some who were unequivocally saying there was no medical examination. How many of those were there?
I would say approximately 20 or 20 people out of that just simply said no medical examination at all that I remember of any kind.
It's a big sample for you to remember, and there'd be no complaint if you can't answer this question. But could you find any factor linking the 8 who had unequivocally been examined for this purpose and the others who had unequivocally not been?
Yes, I could. The difference, well, there's two factors. One is, and I only found a couple of cases of this, but there were, of course, people who did not reveal their names, and these were the most vulnerable. I think David made that point in his testimony yesterday. So what I call the nameless ones, the ones who would answer, that they wouldn't even give the province where they were from, they wouldn't give any character, not even one character of their name. They'd simply say, I'm a Falun Gong practitioner. Where are you from? I'm from the cosmos. Okay. Now, these people
just
were,
let me interrupt you. Their very choice of anonymity as against you would be no indicator of their unwillingness to describe being medically examined.
No, I'm speaking in the labor camp. That in the labor camp they would not give their names, and they had to be actually assigned numbers.
Yeah.
And in this case, they were quite vulnerable and more likely to be examined for their organs. The second factor, and probably the biggest, is the amount of resistance they showed. So if you had somebody who would not sign a statement against Falun Gong, did not break down quickly under torture, had a high threshold for pain, these people were the most likely, by far, to be examined for their organs. The third factor, I just tell you mentioned it, is young people. If you were young and healthy, you were far more likely to receive that examination. Someone who is old would not.
So are you saying, or are we to infer that the 8 unequivocal cases were in some way linked by manifestations of fitness by youth?
Certainly
by in your materials?
Certainly by fitness. I didn't think I went into it enough. I wish I had a little more on that. So now I wish I'd put in an appendix of those 8 people just to sort of square it away. But
okay. Another topic about the intention of the state of China and its authorized entities. You say in page 233, where you're dealing with the Uyghurs, that they, you think, were the very first people to be the subject of harvesting. Is that right? Have I got you right?
that's correct. That's the first ones we know of. There's a case in the 70s of somebody being a political dissident being harvested for their organs in the 70s, but I believe that was kind of a late Cultural Revolution punitive act. It was dramatic. It was done in front of everybody. They sort of cut open the person while they were still alive and took out the organs and attempted to put them in somebody else. I don't really count that. I'm talking about systematic. And the first systematic organ harvesting of political dissidents, because we know, of course, they were doing prisoners all through the 80s and into the 90s, and they start doing live organ harvesting in around 1994, 1995 in Xinjiang. By 1997, that's when we have, and I really wish he was here as a witness. We're having trouble finding him right now. All I can say is the last time I spoke to him, he was on the continent of Europe, and he has family in China. And he was a doctor. I'm sorry, just go on for a second. He was a doctor who was told to go into the political wing of the Urumqi prison. This is in 2007, following the Gulji incident, because 6 high-ranking Chinese Communist Party cadres had checked into the hotel and were waiting for kidneys and livers. And he went and did blood testing of these political prisoners. There was nearly a riot when he did it, because they seemed to understand very clearly what this was about. So I think he's a central witness. I really wish he were here today, but, you know.
The reason I'm asking this is as follows. For certain crimes, and in particular for genocide, a particular mental state has to be established either against an individual or, in the case of a state, however difficult, a state. And the mental state is positive. It's a mental state against a body, a group, whatever it may be. Now, are you saying that there was a policy against the Uyghurs before there was a policy against the Falun Gong?
Yes. But it was very small scale. what we're looking at is, yes, this always started with the Chinese Communist Party. This has never been outside, this has never been a sort of organ broker or some sort of rogue doctor situation. But it begins with a fairly small, these are another way of looking at that first harvesting of Uyghur political prisoners, is that these were seen as the spoils of war. Gulja was considered almost it was a real conflict. It involved, at least on one side, involved guns. 40 people were shot on the first day. Many were executed.
I'm going to stop you because time is short.
Yeah.
And it may not be an answer that to which we'll feel able to, on which we'll feel able to rely through no criticism of you. But would you want to say what, in your opinion, was the intention of the government as against the Uyghurs? And then would you like to tell us what was the intention of the government as against the Falun Gong? Was it the same or was it different?
I think there were similarities, but I think, much the way I just described it, I think this was a sort of a spoils of war case after the Uyghur uprising, if you can call it that, in Gulja. In 1997, Falun Gong was a much more coordinated campaign. It was the biggest campaign China's seen since the Cultural Revolution, the biggest mobilization of internal security forces. The Falun Gong situation, I have no belief that it was started to harvest them. I don't believe, personally, that I've seen no evidence that there's some sort of original document of a final solution or anything like that. I believe this happened over time as the conflict ratcheted up, which is what I try very hard to describe in my book, how that process took place. When it became clear that this was, from their perspective, the Chinese, that this was a movement of martyrs and it was threatening to the state because martyrdom is very powerful.
The last question on this, because I've got several more I must deal with in the remaining 10 minutes. As to the intention of the state, it can develop over time, but it nevertheless can exist. Would you like to say what the intention as against the Falun Gong was? If not, don't feel pressed into answering.
The intention of the state in terms of organ harvesting?
Yes.
Oh, I believe it was twofold. I believe the military, much the way David described it yesterday, has been an entrepreneurial operation for a long time. Deng Xiaoping very clearly said, you're to earn your own keep from now on. You have plenty of resources. You're way too big. We can't afford you. I can give you countless examples of this that I saw on the ground in China. So I believe there was an economic element, but it was clearly an attempt to destroy the enemies of the state at the same time, particularly the most vexing ones, the ones who would not transform, as they put it. The final step is that once the civilian hospitals get involved, this really becomes an economic juggernaut of its own. And that's very clear because it goes to something close to maybe $1 billion a year to what we, by 2016, we're talking about $9 billion a year, 8 to 9, that's our estimate. And I would argue that by now, 2018, it's probably significantly higher.
Okay. Several points disconnected. Please deal with them briefly. As to blood tests, do you have any evidence of what the blood tests were for, by which I mean any primary evidence?
Well, that's, again, why I kind of wish the Uyghur doctor was here, because...
Just give us the answer, please. We're pressed for time.
Okay. He was told explicitly that these were for tissue matching for organs.
He said they were for tissue...
Tissue matching.
Yeah. He said that. Have you seen any primary material confirming that?
It's all over the medical literature. There's plenty of medical literature on this. I'm sure Matt Robertson could give some examples of...
You may be asked another question of that by one of my colleagues before we finish, but I must get through some other matters as well. You use the word recant concerning the Falun Gong. Is that because you believe it to be a religion?
Yes, I do.
you may understand, and I can't remember if you were here yesterday when this was raised, that one approach to the problem, Mr. Vetches, is to say that the total number A of organ transplants must equal B, C, and D, B, voluntary, C, capital punishment cadavers or bodies, whatever they are, plus C, the unknown, Falun Gong. A critical figure before we can come to any conclusion is A, the big figure. Can you tell us, and if not now, because it would take time, tell us in writing, what are the best primary documents to which you have referred and to which we could refer to reach the figure A?
The figure A being, I'm sorry, could you
The
please
total
say it
figure.
Total figure of hospital?
Organ transplants.
Of organ transplants. I think if you want to, you could just go with Wang Jiefu's new figure.
With what?
You could go with Wang Jiefu's new figure of 50,000 and say that we estimated about twice that. We're into the well over the old figures here. Yeah.
Imagine that we engage,
Yeah.
which we probably won't, but we might, a statistician, to say to him, here is a data collection for you, a statistician, to work on. What would be the best primary document or documents for the figure A?
We have 2,400 footnotes in that report.
I beg your pardon?
We have 2,400 footnotes in that report in 2017. The government figures are just made up. The individual hospital figures have meaning. If you put together, and they're gone, by the way. I mean, we have them all archived. But after we put out the report, they disappeared like mushrooms after a spring rain or whatever the expression is.
We may write to you for further about that.
I don't believe there is I think one of the things that's kind of protecting the Chinese Communist Party in this case is that they never put together that kind of estimate or real, certainly any kind of documentation of that. That's what we attempted to do.
Can you help us with current numbers of Falun Gong prisoners?
My last estimate, and that was back in 2000 to estimating for 2000 to 2008, was 500,000 to 1 million in detention at any given time. That's in my appendix. That was based on my survey method of these 50 refugees from labor camp. The figure now, if I had to take a wild guess, would be half that. So we're looking at 500,000 to 250,000 at any given time, simply through attrition, mainly aging. And the arrest rate definitely has gone down for Falun Gong in the provinces. Well, it goes up for the Uyghurs and so forth, but this is a question of skirts going higher or lower.
Could you give us your definition of live organ harvesting?
I believe something that's done really through, it changes over time, but of course you had live organ harvesting of the course that Enver Tohti describes, where somebody is shot in a non-lethal way, which sends the body into shock, and then the doctor begins his work. I don't believe they're using that. They haven't been using that for some time. The example that I'd use is in Jilin City. Wang Lijun was maybe the most famous policeman in China at the time. He was a protege of Bo Xilai, a contender for the presidency, and he was overseeing organ harvesting. The organ harvesting there, from everything we understand, especially his award ceremony, where he received award for a new lethal injection method, was all being done by doctors, soup to nuts.
Can you provide detail of the 50 interviews in the sense of, are the records of the 50 interviews, are they all available somewhere?
Well, I have tapes of every one of those interviews and notes, but you'd be the first person to listen to them since Amnesty International has never been interested, so nor has anyone else.
They exist in the form of tape recordings?
They exist digitally, and some of them I actually were so sensitive that I tape recorded them on a little mini cassette tape player, and I still have those tapes up in Vermont somewhere. I could dig them out. I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you very much. who do you think was doing the organ harvesting in the sense of, well, who do you think was doing it, with what background, and who instructed them to do it?
You mean in terms of the surgeons?
Sorry?
In terms of the surgeons themselves?
I think so, yes. It's a question on behalf of one of my colleagues. I think so, yeah.
We have different stories on that. In the beginning, I really don't know. This is something we know more about right now, partly through Dr. Ko-Wen-je, who, again, the current mayor of Taipei, who was so involved in this organ harvesting. And what surfaced is a superstar system, a kind of a series of doctors who've become known for doing extractions. One of them has done, he claims, 10,000 extractions. And he is still around. He's got Maseratis, and he's got a Facebook page where he shows off his calligraphy as well. These people are superstars in China, okay? That star system may not be resident everywhere, but it's certainly a very visible part of this. Beyond that, I think it's very hard to see into that medical world. It's purposely kept under wraps. Now, there's one other point I'd add, and World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong has documented this very well, that there's also extremely high suicide rate among the surgeons who specialize in extraction, and they've documented this in a report. They're really, by the way, I would say they are the real experts. They have one woman who's made it her life's work to do nothing but look at the surgeons and their bios.
I'm asked to check again, what do you say was the intention with respect to the Falun Gong? You've given us an answer a bit, but I'd like you to repeat it. What was the intention?
Specifically with respect to the Falun Gong, not to organ harvesting. In other words, what was the initial appraisal of the Falun Gong, and what was their attitude and intent before organ harvesting entered the picture?
Yeah, I don't believe it was to destroy Falun Gong. I've always been a little suspect of the whole Jiang Zemin saying this statement about giving this order to destroy their reputations, destroy them physically, and so forth. I believe that in the beginning it was simply to destroy what they considered to be a movement which was outside of the bounds of the Communist Party and was religious, and therefore we're going to destroy it. Over time it becomes something else because of the resistance. That is the key thing. Over time it becomes an attempt to simply eradicate anyone who still holds those beliefs. There's not a live and let live system. That gets withdrawn. Again, by two factors, both by an economic factor, because these people are actually worth money, and mainly because they're not just living and let living. They are handing out leaflets. They are talking about this. And internationally, the very efforts that have been made by people like me, who is just a friend of Falun Gong or something, that's the way I describe it, because I'm not very religious, or as religious as a cabbage, we may not be helping matters. We may be condemning people to death for all we know. This is the point, is that the overall conflict, this conflict actually becomes global.
One last question in the remaining seconds. Professor Elliott may have a further question you want to clarify.
Yeah, I just want to, sorry, press my microphone. Just the idea of one man doing 10,000 extractions, just practically, is quite a challenging concept. Where was he based, and how might he have achieved those numbers?
You know, I can look that up for you. I just learned about him recently, and I was interested because he was at a conference with Dr. Ko-Wen-je, where Ko-Wen-je was the only foreigner at the conference in 2008. He does have a bio. I believe it's probably a boast, but I can certainly send you a talk I just gave at Westminster, where he's one of the people I describe.
And following up on this concept of boasting, we heard yesterday about resume padding. Why should we believe the hospitals aren't doing the same thing? Why should we trust what they say rather than what the government says? Both have got an axe to grind of some kind, perhaps.
I agree with that completely, except that, you know, this is one of those things where I've lived in China for, you know, as a business consultant for 3 years, and my impression was that people will exaggerate, but only so far. So as I say, it's about 25% of the fish. The fish gets about 25% bigger in describing, and that's very common. You'll see it in the sewing machine factory. I mean, you'll see it all over the place. The hospitals don't make up this stuff completely. They have to have some sort of backup. They name the surgical teams, for example. And if they have 7 surgical teams, that's a lot of people. And you probably are going to get a lot of transplants out of that 2,000, they claim, per year. Now, I believe, you know, when you're getting into those numbers, you know, sometimes there is this tendency to describe as if they never even go to the bathroom or something, or they work on holidays. And this is not true. But I think it's still better than the government numbers, which are just completely, have no basis whatsoever, as far as we can see. I mean, they're not based on anything. We had Matt Robertson did a very good article which showed that Tianjin Central Hospital alone was doing 5,000 organ transplants per year by their own figures. So that's half of the supposed total. No, that's, we know that we can easily come to that at Sun Yat-sen, Zhongshan, Shanghai, Beijing 309 Military Hospital. You're already up to 10, you know, well over 10,000. So this is very easy to make those points. And that's why we, again, go for a range. This is all I'd ask, you know, it's up to you how to do it, but I believe that a range I don't like the appearance of being completely accurate in such a case. This is like wartime research. It's not like reading a corporate balance sheet.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goodman, thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. You are, of course, free to stay and watch the remainder of it.
May I ask you one thing? I don't believe that my statement here is the most recent wordsmith statement. Would it be terrible if I put in? It's practically the same thing. It just has some embarrassing typos and things in it.
Typos you needn't trouble with. Anything of substance, please correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Sabi or Ms. Nice?
The next witnesses are David Lee and Dr. Hagley. They present a report that appears at page 234 onward from China Organ Harvesting Research Center.
Sorry, this is the, I know there's been a change in the timetable. Is this a witness 12?
These are witnesses, yes.
Thank you.
We have 2 witnesses attesting to this report. So.
Dr. Lee, thank you very much for coming to the tribunal to give your evidence. You understand that you must tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good morning, gentlemen. You have submitted a report that appears at page 234 of the document before you. This report sets out in a very systematic way the way you have approached the organ harvesting in China, and I would like to take you through the steps that you have mentioned in the report. If we start with the on-demand nature of transplants performed in China, can you explain how this short visiting times and making appointments ahead of the schedule is conducted in China?
So to talk about the on-demand nature of the organ transplantation, this is unique in the whole world, because there is reports from different directions that the waiting time in China is extremely short, and this is not only from reports from outside, also from inside by themselves. There are, in 2005, for example, the Tianjin Transplantation Center said that the average waiting time for a liver are only 2 weeks on their website. So in Shanghai, the Changzheng Hospital, which is a transplant institute of the army, they said that the average waiting time for a liver is only 1 week in 2005. And this is also true in the China Organ and Transplantation Assisted Center, which is an institution that founded at the China Medical University with the single purpose for organ tourism, so to get people from outside transplanted. And on their website, they say that organ provider can be found immediately, so at any time. So these are the time between 2004 and 2006. And even recently, in the telephone recordings in between 2016 and 2017, and there is also such answers that they can provide organ very fast. The very last two cases are, the one is in 2017. The Korean, South Korean journalist went to the Tianjin transplanting center. They said that they are relative for a patient. And also here in this hospital, they told the journalist that the waiting time are between days and weeks, no longer than the longest. The difficult cases are not longer than 2 months. So this is 2017. And the very last evidence is from the BBC journalist, Matthew Hill. He himself called a hospital in Guangzhou in China, 2018, in this year. And he was he got the answer that he could have had a liver within weeks of time.
Thank you.
This cannot be explained by any official sources. China said that last year they have 15,000 transplantations based on 5,000 voluntary donations. But this 5,000 voluntary donation can never enable a transplantation within days or weeks.
Understood. You mentioned that it is common practice in China to excise whole vital organs from living body. What is the evidence for this? This is a very important statement, but what sort of evidence you have to support this statement?
This was based on the method how they took organs. Because if you take only the liver, for example, for transplantation, this you must do it very precisely, and it takes a longer time. This would increase the warm ischemia time. So that's why the doctors in China have developed a method so that they cut the organs in the abdominal room altogether very quickly, and then separate the liver afterwards. So this means that the organs, all the very important organs in the abdominal room would be cut.
Can it not be done when the donor or whoever is having the liver is dead, brain dead, or clinically dead, and still cut the same way?
Right, this is also possible, but
if we can move on, we come to the scale and capacity of the China's transplant system. You estimate the capacity to be around 70,000 transplant a year, but that's an estimate. But you say it may be more than that because in some hospitals they have reached 131% of the capacity. Can you elaborate on that?
So to calculate the real transplant number is very difficult. This is obvious. But what is known is that there is this official requirement for the hospitals. So in 2007, there were 164 hospitals who get the approval by the government. And the calculation in our report is based on the minimum request. This leads to a number of 70,000. But you can see this is only the capacity requirement of the hospitals. You can see that perhaps they have the capacity, but they don't perform such a number of transplantation. This is it's possible. But on the other hand, we should also consider that this is based on the minimum requirement. Many hospitals have a much higher number dedicated for transplantation. The biggest is with 500 beds for transplantation in Tianjin, one single transplant center. And for this hospital, there were two number of use rate of the beds. The one was 90% at the time of 2009, when the building get reconstructed, and the company who is responsible for the construction has published this the situation, and this says that the bed utilization rate is at 90%. 90% with 500. So you can calculate this hospital alone can perform a very high number of transplantation. The other number of use rate is at 130. This is also from the hospital itself, this number.
Yes, the suggestions may be that they might be boasting or exaggerating the numbers. One other issue that was raised was that if you compare the capacity with the Western world capacity, there is a difference in treatment. In China, the patients are kept 3 to 4 weeks, but while in Europe and United States, they are kept between 3 to 4 days in hospital. So there is a difference in the use of capacity in Chinese treatment compared to the US and European treatment. And therefore, the calculation of capacity on the basis of number of beds may be wrong the way you're calculating.
Yes, that's why we put a very large room for the calculation. We calculate every patient for 1 month, so 4 weeks stay in a hospital. That's realistic.
So that's okay. Let's move on. Your other section is sources of organ, and of course, everybody agrees that the use of death row prisoners is declining, and China had officially declared that they stopped this practice. The tribunal has been struggling with the calculation of the numbers that the missing item one, the main issue being how many organs transplantation had taken place in the year, how many of them from death row prisoners, how many of them from the donation by organ donors, and the gap that remains between the two would be the one that this tribunal wants to clarify and investigate. Do you have an idea as to how these numbers can be constructed? How many organs, for instance, in the last 3 years were coming from the still death row prisoners? How many were coming from organ donors? And what is the gap that we need to find out where it comes from?
Okay, we can start with a very conservative calculation based on the official numbers published by China. For example, China's official number for transplantation in the year 2004 is 12,000 transplantation. So in this year, in the 2004, the only official source is organs from executed prisoners. Okay,
Yeah.
So then we can calculate how many people were executed in that year. There is no official number. The highest estimation was 10,000, which is not realistic. The lowest number is 2,000, documented by Amnesty International. The real number is very likely in the middle. Let's say it is just for a simple calculation. Let's say it is 4,000 execution. Okay, in that year, outside China, the whole world combined for 2004 execution, the whole world was 400. So if we say China alone executed 4,000, that's high enough. Even we take this number for 4,000 execution, each person have 1 liver and 2 kidneys. It is possible to get from this 4,000 execution 12,000 organs. And the official number of transplantation in China is 12,000 transplantation. It fits perfectly, you may think. But you must also have to think about that many prisoners are not suitable for transplantation. They are either too old or ill or has hepatitis infections. It's not possible. And you should also consider that the organ transplantation and organ harvesting is a local business. It's actually illegal how the doctors do it. That's why it happens only on a local basis. It's on the personal relationship basis. If the doctor knows the judge, he can get the organs. If the doctor has no relation, he cannot get the organs. So this means that at that time, there is no system at all for sharing of organs. So at each occasion of execution, in which city, you may have 10 execution and you may have 20 patients. If the organ fits the patient, it can be taken, can be used. If not, it cannot be used. Because of this characteristic, because it's a local business, the real utilization rate of the organs from execution for transplantation is very low. It can never reach 30%, not possible. So if we came back, we take a very conservative number, 12,000 transplantation from the Chinese government. It is possible to really get 12,000 organs, but the most organs cannot be used because there is no sharing system. So if we take the lowest number, the official number of China, this 12,000 transplantation, it cannot be explained by its official source. So even for this very low number, the majority of organs must come from another source, not from the official source of execution.
And what about donation? I mean, they are, as you have listed, 373,000 registered donors.
This is afterwards, yeah?
Yes, this is in 2017.
In 2017, the registration in China was 373,000 registered donors. This number is extremely low. If you think about it, in US, there are 130 million registered organ donors. And from this 130 million registered donors, the result from such donors are 5,000 real donations. The other 5,000 are from ICUs in US. So last year, the US have totally 10,000 voluntary donation. The half are from registered donors, the half are from non-registered donors. This means from 130 million registered organ donors, you can get 5,000 real organ donors. This means that the Chinese number of 373,000 registered donors have no meaning at all. The maximum number of actually organ donors from the registered organ donors cannot be more than 30.
Yes. You also mentioned that there is no proper support for organ donation, as Mr. Hang Jae-fu has mentioned. There is only one person overseeing organ donation organization, while this is compared with 1,500 in the United States. That's correct.
Yes, that's the situation it is.
Can you also expand on on your suggestions that reporting from Hang Jae-fu's statement that 70% of the organ donations came from brain-dead donors?
While you're waiting to answer that, Mr. Sabi, we have got two witnesses here. Are we confirming that this is the opinion of both?
This is the report by, I will clarify that if you would like. Can you confirm that you both represent the China Organ Harvest Research Center?
Yes, I do.
Yes. And
Yes.
And this report is authored by both of you?
Yes, and also agrees.
Yep.
And also, can you briefly advise the tribunal of the nature of China Organ Harvest Research Center?
So the Research Center is a nonprofit organization that was founded in the United States. It was officially established in 2017, incorporated, but the research team that has been working on this issue has been doing it for at least 10 years. It was just not a formal organization before that time.
Thank you. The tribunal may have some further questions for you.
Hi. So the first thing I wanted to focus on is in the back of the report, you go into an analysis about genocide. So the first thing I wanted to look at is page 10. You go into discussion on the policy of destruction. So it's page 243 in the book, but page 10 in your specific report. And your analysis really focuses on the former leader, Zemin, and his policy of destroying the Falun Gong. What I wanted to know is, since with the new premier, has that policy changed, increased, or decreased towards the Falun Gong?
So, to our knowledge, there has not been a change, at least one that's observable, because we know that the, let's say, the persecution of Falun Gong, which is to say the arrests, the torture, none of that has really changed. Like, it's still very much ongoing, and we haven't seen either an increasing trend or a decreasing trend.
Okay, so the panel just heard from Mr. Gutman, and he said that the arrests of the Falun Gong have actually been decreasing. What would be your comment to that?
We haven't specifically analyzed that number. There are ups and downs over time in the number of arrests.
Okay. When Mr. Sabi had asked you before about the statement on page 4 about it is common practice in China to excise vital organs, is that a common practice that is geared towards all of the Chinese people, that it could be anybody, or are you specifically commenting that it's targeted towards a specific group of people?
So this was referring to all the transplants that were conducted, well, basically all the transplants that were being conducted at the time, which at the time we knew that there were no voluntary donations.
Okay.
And so it would be the other sources, like other than voluntary donations.
Do you have any type of data that would support it being targeted towards specific groups?
Not for the specific technique for organ extraction.
Okay, but what about the source of the organs?
Well, we do know that at the time their brain death was not the source. At least one of the hospitals, I know the China International Network Assistance Center, they specifically said that on their website, on their English website, that their organs did not come from brain death donors.
Okay, let me clarify. So what I mean is the type of person they're taking it from. So is there any data that would say these organs come from the Uyghurs? These organs come from the Falun Gong?
No.
No. Okay. So do you know how they? So Mr. Gutman also presented to the panel that there is a DNA testing that is going on, and that they take it from different groups. So do you think is it possible that they're discerning between who they want to take it from, or is whatever organs that they're able to access?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. The other thing that you discuss in the report is the fact that Zemin's policy was focused on the eradication of the Falun Gong physically, and then you also talk about, in the same report, about wanting to convert them. And to me, it feels like there's some tension between eradication and conversion. So can you just explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's a dynamic going on here where, a lot of pretty much all the Falun Gong practitioners who were arrested, they were given the choice between, giving up the practice or renouncing the practice, and not renouncing the practice. Well, I mean, unfortunately, they're not officially given that choice, but they are basically put through all of this torture, all of these abuses, to get them to renounce the practice. And by renounce, I mean, it's not just saying, oh, I give up, I'm not going to practice anymore. You have to sign multiple statements saying that you renounce your belief, that you publicly denounce Falun Gong, that you will not participate in any Falun Gong activities, and you will help, quote unquote, transform other practitioners of Falun Gong. So they will basically put you in the service of doing the same thing to, your fellow practitioners, or former practitioners. In that sense, for someone who is, someone who's a true believer, they're a spiritual person, for them to renounce their faith, especially in such a way, one is a public denunciation, and two is actively helping the Chinese regime, convert other people. To them, that represents almost like a spiritual death to them, because to them that would also mean their own destruction spiritually. The other option would be to, well, sorry, I should go back. So if they were to do that, then to them, it is a spiritual death, and also they would no longer be part of the group being targeted, which is the Falun Gong. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Okay, on page 14, which is page 247 in the book, you all cite to sampling, and I'm curious: is this a survey or a data that you gathered, or is this a citation to another? Because I see a footnote, and I look back at it. So, are you citing another source to this, or is this something you all did?
Yeah, this is a collection of a lot of reports that have been published on this topic.
And based on your analysis of these reports, would you say that these methods that are used systematically against the Falun Gong?
Yes.
Okay, and would you say that it's widespread across China used against the Falun Gong, or targeted towards those that may be in Beijing or specific areas of China?
No, this is all over China.
All over China. And would you say the same is true for the Uyghurs? Or do you have any knowledge?
I don't personally have knowledge of that.
Of that, okay.
But from what we have seen, it is common practice in all detention centers, labor camps, prisons, all over China.
The other thing I want to also ask you about is the rape and gang rape and sexual torture. And that is, so would it be, reading from this, that is also targeted towards the Falun Gong?
Yes.
Okay. And what about children? Do you have any data that supports that children are being targeted?
Not to my knowledge.
Right.
At least in terms of being arrested and tortured. Yeah, I don't have records of that.
Okay. Let me see if there's any questions from my colleagues here. Does anybody have any questions? I don't have any.
Have you checked with the opinion of both doctors?
May I just ask a question? Could you clarify for us a little bit more about who you think is extracting the organs? What type of people are You alluded to it earlier on, but I just want to be a little clearer about their background, where they come from, who carries out the orders, whether they are separate from recipient and donor team, and how that whole practice is integrated.
So, from other reports that we've seen, from Chinese sources and otherwise, they have deliberately separated the procurement teams from the recipient teams in terms of medical staff. So the doctors who are performing the transplants themselves, who are transplanting organs into the recipients, they are insulated from where the organs are actually coming from.
Okay.
And if people are doing transplants in the Western environment, they know a massive amount of detail about the donor and the organ which they're transplanting. Are you aware of any evidence to let us know what is known by the recipient team about either the organ or the donor, or both?
So from what medical staff in China have reportedly said, they do tests, at least on the organ itself, but I'm not aware of what specific information they get from the donor. Do you have anything to add?
Okay. Did you want to comment?
There are single reports who the people say that the doctor said that they can obtain the organs by themselves, so they know much, but I don't know whether this is always the case, but there are such reports.
Okay. Do you take the position that the Falun Gong is a religion?
Yes.
Okay. Can you comment, because there seems to be a lot based on the submissions we've received. It's not a definitive answer. So do you know why there's debate over, or can you comment on why there's a debate as to whether it is a religion?
Well, the only debate I'm aware of is the diverging definition from between what the Chinese government says and what other people say. So of course, if you listen to the official state propaganda, they would say it's an evil cult or whatever term they choose to use. But I'm not aware of any other definitions that are being debated.
Well, so what would be the definition of religion in China? Or how would they define a religious group?
I'm not familiar with that definition.
Okay, and can you answer it too?
I don't know the definition in China for religion. No.
All right.
It should be noted that there's no word in Chinese for religion that corresponds directly. Every religion is a jiao, and Confucianism, Buddhism, all of them are jiao. And the word for religion is simply all of the jiao, zong jiao. And this has been created in response to the existence of a generalization, a general word in the West, religion. So this question is very, very difficult to answer from the context of the Chinese language, because you're asking, what is the word? When in fact, in Chinese, there is no native word for religion in the way that it's understood as a generality in the West. There is only a collective noun which says the assorted teachings, the many teachings. And this makes it very, very difficult to compare the categorization. So when the Chinese government abuses Falun Gong, they will say that it's a xie jiao, that it is heretical or it's a harmful jiao, where there would be other jiao that would be presumably not harmful.
And have you a question for the witnesses, or?
No, I just think it's essential because I can see very clearly.
No, do you have a question for the witnesses? If not, it's very helpful for us, but do you have a question for the witnesses?
But do you agree with what I said?
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, I would say so. One thing I just thought of that would be helpful to remember in the context of the Chinese regime is that in China, all types of religions are regulated by the state, or at least the ones that they choose to recognize. And so if you have, that includes like any kind of Buddhists, Christians, any kind of church, organized or otherwise, if you don't comply with whatever, the Communist Party or the government chooses to, or how they choose to regulate you, then you are, you become the target of persecution and being eliminated.
Absent somebody identifying as Falun Gong or doing the practices publicly, how would the government know that somebody is part of the Falun Gong? Is there any other way to identify?
So there are a few different ways. One is prior knowledge of people who used to practice Falun Gong. At least they would do the exercises publicly. Most of this happened before the persecution started in 1999. And so the police have built up blacklists of people. So before they started the persecution, they have sent people to those practice sites and, collected all of that information. Another way would be a lot of Falun Gong practitioners in China continue to distribute materials, flyers, pamphlets, to tell other people about the persecution that's going on. So that's one of the main ways that people in China today would get arrested for practicing Falun Gong. And I know there are some other more organized campaigns by the authorities to go around. I think they call it a knocking on doors campaign, where they will literally go down their list of people who they knew, at least at some point in the past, who practiced Falun Gong, and they would go and literally knock on their doors and ask them, do you still practice Falun Gong? Okay. And if you do, then, of course, the same thing happens.
And do you, one of my colleagues wants to ask, do you think it is the intent of the state or the Chinese government to destroy the Falun Gong?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and
That's for sure, yeah.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one last question. Following Mr. Waldron's extremely helpful intervention and question, if we use the word category, is category a word that makes ready sense in your language? To categorize something?
Sure.
And what I'd like your help with is this. Does Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Falun Gong fall into the same category, or are they in any way in different categories?
I would say so. I mean, if you say all of them are religions, then
they're all
religions.
And the word is the same.
That would be the one category.
The word to characterize Christianity is Jidu Jiao. Jiao. It's this word Jiao.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's a difference in that with Falun Gong. It's not an organized religion, and so you don't have churches. You don't have. There are some differences in that regard, but for the purposes of spiritual belief, I think they're the same in that regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much for coming. One of you is going to be speaking to us this afternoon separately, but in any event, you're free to join us in the public sector if you like. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Sabi?
Thank you very much. Our next witness is online, and it's Mr. Tony Leo, joining us from Australia, where it is 10:30 in the evening for 10:25.
I understand that the position is that the next two witnesses, or certainly one of them, who we'd hoped to hear with video and audio, will only be by audio. The video equipment cannot be made to work for them. So is this a case of headphones again, or not?
Yes.
So it'd be headphones, even though it's in, I don't know what language it's in, but still. Chinese, yeah. And are we ready now to go?
Soon.
Are we ready? is the witness online, please? That's the court finding. It's coming now.
Mr. Sabi, for both of these witnesses, if they're both audio only, given that the public have no sight of the witness statements, it may be as well to give from their statements, if you have it, a few details of age, occupation and matters of that sort,
Yes.
where you wouldn't normally do it, because it'll give something of a picture of the
Yes,
person to whom they're listening.
our next witness is Tony Liu. He's age 38, is male, and speaks in Chinese. He was detained from November 2006 to January 2009 in different re-education camps and brainwashing. He suffered massive torture, and he was medically tested. These are the questions we'll be asking him once he's available.
Which I think he probably is now. Yep.
We cannot still hear the witness. Are we connected?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Liu. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks. I can hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, I think he can hear us now.
He can hear us now.
You can? Yes, good evening. Can you mention your name and where you're now giving your evidence from?
Hi,
my name is Jintao Liu. I'm in Sydney, Australia.
Yes, thank you for giving evidence. You were detained from November 2006 to January 2009 in different labor and re-education camps. Can you tell the tribunal how you were tortured and the reason for?
It was the end of November 2006 when I was a postgraduate. One day, when we're having lunch break, Beijing Changping District domestic security guy came and my supervisor called me. They asked me to go back to the office. When I get to the office, 5 or 6 police followed my supervisor came in. On my PC, they found Falun Gong material and the night commentary on Communist Party. I asked them, what right you have to search in my computer and arrest me? Then police produced the paper and write something on it. Then he said, you asked for search warrant, here you are. Then I was kidnapped from my school to Beijing Changping brainwash camp. In Changping brainwash camp, they asked me to give up my belief. They said if I write down repentant statement and stop practicing Falun Gong, they will let me back to school to finish my study. For I refused to give up my faith. After detaining me there for more than 1 month, they transferred me to Changping Detention Center. In Beijing Changping Detention Center, because I resisted the unlawful interrogation and refused to sign any document. Insisting nothing wrong with President Falun Dafa. After more than 30 days unlawful detention without any legal procedure, I was sentenced to 2 years in labor camp. Then I was transferred to Beijing Tuanhe Dispatching Center. Assigned for dispatching of people being sentenced to labor camp. Beijing Tuanhe Labor Re-Education Dispatching Center.
Dispatch center.
When I get there, they immediately forced me to take a health examination, and I refused. For I kept on shouting Falun Dafa, it's good. 4 policemen took me. Took me to a single room, stripped off my clothing, put a cloth into my mouth, stopped me from shouting. In the following days, they always have 4 inmates to beat me, and the policemen play tricks. various crooked policemen play stick and a carrot, try to transform me, but I refuse. After they detaining me in the first division, I was transferred to the division for drug addict. There I was detained in a single cell. Drug addict inmate was instructed to prosecute me. That cell was monitored 24 hours with cameras. Police will know whatever happened in there. One day, an inmate called Jay hit my waist. Another inmate came in, said, try not to damage his organs. I was quite shocked by what I heard. Did they care about me as a person or my organs? I know without the permission from police, no one were allowed to get into my cell. Thus, the inmate must have been instructed by police to say those words. One of the inmates assigned to persecute me once said to the others, he knew a Beijing lady, her husband, Press Falun Gong, being arrested, then vanished, never came back. During a period, police once asked me to write a repentance statement, or at least agree to obey the rule for inmates in writing. The repentance statement would be dealt by Tuanhe labor camps later. After my rejection, they asked the drug addict inmate in various ways to torture me. They asked the drug addict inmate pin me on the back. They put pieces of papers with my master name and Falun Dafa on my body. They beat me, twist my fingers, make my fingers swollen.
Mr. Sabi, may I just
after I couldn't bear it and put on writing said I'm going to follow the rule for inmates, they stopped.
Okay, so I just say thank you. The tribunal will now ask some questions from...
No, not, I hadn't reached that stage, Mr. Sabi. I just wanted you to look, please, at pages 269 and 70. Yes. The bottom of 269, beginning November 2007, and the paragraph continuing to the end of the paragraph on 2000, starting on 269, ending on 270,
Yes.
contains graphic details of torture that may not be pleasant, I don't know, for the witness to repeat, and may or may not merit airtime in public. It might, however, be valuable for an acknowledgement by the witness that he made this statement and that this graphic detail is accurate. I'm not stopping you calling it or anybody else asking it, but I'm not sure it's necessarily good material to be given in evidence unless there's a good need.
No, just a moment. Mr. Liu, please translate this. Mr. Liu, your statement has been read by the tribunal, and you don't need to repeat that here, and thank you for this statement. The tribunal has some questions that will now ask you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Liu, for testifying before the tribunal and sharing with us your detailed statements. My first sets of questions about the three statements that you forced to give to the prison guards and authorities because you couldn't bear the severe torture anymore. Could you please tell us a little bit more about the three statements, and in particular, how did they look like? Were they like forms that you had to fill in, or or did they give you a template that you needed to follow, or you had to write them and sign them by your own?
Initially, at the Beijing Tuanhe Labor Dispatching Center, initially there wasn't a formal form. At the Beijing Tuanhe Labor Center, the statement was only to obey the rule for inmates only. The denounce statement was orally saying denounce the belief in Falun Dafa. The repentant statement was a template written by somebody else.
have a copy of the repentance statement? Your repentance statement, I mean.
Called the repentant statement. The repentance statement was written by somebody else. Asked me to copy. I don't have it now.
In the process of forced transformation, were there any particular word or phrase that the torturer would use to, in order to degrade you or other Falun Gong prisoners or Falun Dafa?
I don't understand.
So was there any particular word or phrase that the prison guards used to insult you or your faith?
Yes, they always, some policemen, especially in the brainwash camp, the 610 office officials slandered in such a way.
Could you tell us what's the word or phrase?
The police would say my master was a cheater and collecting money. They said my master ran to America where he bear for him. We asked the inmate to challenge us, say, your master was so capable, why he let you being persecuted here? Ask your master to save you here, to rescue you. At the same time, they will play video slandering Dafa and my master. Actually, during this period, I was surrounded by this environment slandering around me. I don't want to remember those words. When they saying those things, I try myself to empty my mind with these words.
You may not, so you don't have answer to this question, but I wonder if you are still practicing Falun Gong.
Yes.
So in your witness testimony, you said that you were kept in isolation until you signed the 3 statements, and then they transferred you to another cell which you shared with other forced transform Falun Gong practitioners. How long did you? How long were you there before you were released? And if while in detention, did you see any other Falun Gong prisoners being disappeared?
I was in November 2007 being forced to write the 3 statements. After writing the 3 statements, I was kept in there for maybe 1 or 2 years. I couldn't remember clearly. Since then till November 2009, I was with those being transformed and also some ordinary inmates. During the period, in this cell, in the same cell, also have many other inmates being asked to monitor. Therefore, between the practitioners being transformed, we couldn't communicate. In fact, I didn't know anyone vanished during that period.
Thank you. And what about the age of the other detainees, Falun Gong detainees in that cell? Did you see any children or underage prisoners?
That time I was in the 1st division. There was no child there. At that time, I possibly was the youngest one, as they told me. The eldest one was 70. One older one was released due to brain hemorrhage as a result of persecution. That's what I heard after being released.
In your witness testimony, you said that you felt you had betrayed your belief and you sold your soul and conscience. Do you consider your practice of Falun Gong as a religion?
For myself, Falun Gong is, to me, is a faith. At that time, except Falun Gong, nothing else can stop my morality from declining.
Thank you. That was my. Oh, sorry.
As a definition of religion, there might be some difference between the West and the East culture. I only care about following truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance principle.
Thank you. This is the chairman of the tribunal speaking, and I have one question for you. You told us of the man saying to the man who was beating you, "Don't injure his organs." Do you know if that was because they genuinely wanted to preserve your organs, or were adding pressure to get you to succumb to what they wanted you to do about giving up Falun Gong?
The inmate beat me is to force me to write the 3 statements, but the other one came in to say not to damage my organ. I was surprised because that time before I was being arrested, there's also have reports saying in Liaoning province there's an organ harvest things happen, but however, I was unwilling to believe that. When that person said that, I was quite surprised. I was thought whether they are saying they don't want to damage my organ is because my organ was useful. However, I was unwilling to believe that's true. Rather believe they really care about me.
Thank you for making yourself available to the tribunal to give evidence. I'm sorry it has not been possible for us to see you on our television screens, but thank you very much for helping. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break because the next witnesses are timetabled and it's likely to increase the risk of technical difficulty if we break the planned timings of their connections to our technical staff. 20 minutes only. Next witness at 12 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that quickly, Andy. That was very helpful.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.